Carlton King, the former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations, but also, and probably mostly, looks into the world of geopolitics, the political world around us that often people don't see, but affects their lives massively. Today, what I want to do is to do one of my critical thinking broadcasts. Let's call it that. They're not lessons, they're just a broadcast. And because it's in Britain Black History Month, I wanted to do it on Black history at its widest. And I wanted to explain why I'm doing it and where that came from. Now, I'm going to go back in time first to explain how I believe Black History Month got off the ground. And it has something to do with me. So I can go back to 1984. I was a uniformed police officer in the Metropolitan Police Service. And I'd just come out of training school. And I went to an area called Rochester Row Police Station, which is in the city of Westminster. And on our ground, as the police call it, the area where we were patrolling, was the then really the only black organisation that had any governmental approval. That was the Commission for Racial Equality. And that commission was headed up by a man called Sir Herman Ouseley. So I went in to see Herman and I explained who I was. I was in uniform, so he saw me as a constable, and I guess he thought, who is this PC, this police constable, speaking to me? Anyway, I got an appointment, spoke to him. And I explained that I'd worked for the Americans and that the Americans have a thing called the Black History Month. And I said to him that I feel that we should have that same month in the United Kingdom, which month is immaterial. But the reality is to get over to the British black people that, number one, they belong in Britain, and number two, that they can achieve. Because what I noted was that by the way that we had grown up and by the history that we had, and this is why I'm going to go into slavery and other histories, but that isn't our only history, but I have to go into that to explain, that we oftentimes felt incapable and were growing up and basically educated to be incapable. And that what you really needed was a situation whereby individuals would understand that black people had helped, like every other type of people in this world, to create the world we live in. And so I suggested to him that he should push for a Black History Month. Now, he told me to write to the Secretary of State for Education at the time, a woman by the name of Estelle Morrish. And I did that. And I wrote to her and I explained why we should have a Black History Month. And basically she said, I do not control the national curriculum. So there wasn't a push there. But I guess Sir Herman pushed it further and we ended up with the Black History Month we have. Now the criticism that I have of the Black History Month is that it's basically 20th century centric. It talks about people who lived in the 20th century and what they've done who just happen to be black, of generally West Indian heritage, etc. What it doesn't do, to my mind, is anchor the black community in Great Britain and indeed in Europe and beyond, because all that's important. So this critical thinking session is to actually do that. But let's start off first. I don't want to spend too much time on this introduction. But let's start off by saying that what we first need to look at is define what is black. Now, I'll do that because there's a fellow by the name of Hans-Josef Blumenbach. And by the way, throughout this talk, don't just listen to what I'm saying and take it as rubbish or take it as gospel. What I want you to do is I want you to look up, all of you listeners, to look up what I'm saying and either debunk me, which you won't be able to do, or learn by going to look at various books on the internet, or British Museum obviously would be the best place to go to if you're in the United Kingdom. But you can also get that information in the United States and elsewhere, because this is for the world, so it's not just for Britain. So what I'd say is that first defining black is something that is actually quite difficult. For most people who live in the United States and indeed beyond, it's just a matter of melanin in one's makeup. And maybe in some places it means you've got curly hair, but I don't think that's a necessity, because you can be anything. All I know is that if we took the United States as an example, and that flows over into the United Kingdom, and oftentimes into the rest of the world, purely and simply because the United States is by far the most powerful country in the world, and its thoughts and ideas and understandings have been passed to the rest of the world. And before that, Great Britain was that most powerful country in the world, and its thoughts and ideas are passed to the rest of the world. That passing of that understanding from countries which are perceived to be white, and I'll use the word perceived to be white because I'll explain that later on, is what we often hear, and therefore that's how we perceive people who are black. So what I'd say is this. I'm going to say to some extent that's wrong, because if you look in the United States and you look post the US Civil War, of course, as everybody knows, the Union Army won that war. The Union won the war against the South that tried to secede from the Union. And thereafter they had periods of reconstruction. First was the presidential reconstruction, and then they had what was known as a radical reconstruction, where the Republican Party, yes, the Republican Party, not the Democrats, the Republican Party, which was the party of those who saw slavery as a negative. Now, it wasn't always because it was slavery. Oftentimes it was because it was a poor means of production. And the means of production that they favoured amongst the Republicans was mechanised means of production, whereas the Democrats, the Southerners as a general rule, preferred the means of using manual labour, which was enslaved people who, once you'd created them, once you'd got them, once you'd enslaved them, and they were a cost, don't get me wrong. It's been estimated that something like 75% of the wealth of the southern states of the United States at the time of the Civil War in 1861, was taken up in the cost of enslaved people. So in other words, their wealth was the enslaved people. So there is a cost to that. But they also came up with ideas as to how not to have that cost. So rather than bringing people from Africa that were costly, you had to bring them across the ocean, you had to pay for them from the slavers who did that. What they wanted to do was to create their own enslaved people in the United States, in the South. And they did that. And by the way, this trade had been happening at that stage by about 250 years of moving enslaved Africans to the United States. And by the way, I should note, only about 12% of the enslaved people went to the United States. The rest went to the Caribbean, which was run by the British, and by Central America and South America, run by, at one stage, Portuguese and Spanish, Swedish, French, etc., etc. They all had their slave areas in the Caribbean, and all of them had enslaved people in them. So what I'm saying to you is all of the areas from all the way down from Argentina, all the way back up to Mexico, had a lot of enslaved people. And we're going to jump about on this session just to give you an idea. It should be noted that there were as many black people, I'm going to explain what black means, in Argentina as there were white people all the way up to the 19th, 20th century. Now, you look in Argentina today and you say, oh, well, there aren't any. But they were. And the first president, actually, for free Argentina was a black guy, which you may call mixed race. Okay, so let's explain what I say the colour black is. I say it's people that are melanated, people with colour in them, where their heritage is potentially African, but not necessarily. Because what you need to understand is, if everybody came out of Africa, as is now the accepted perspective around the world, even the Chinese, who previously had a perspective that that wasn't the case, that everybody came out of Africa, but now the Chinese government accepts that everybody came out of Africa. At one stage, we were all Africans. So I'm not just going back to that, tens of thousands of years before. I'm not even going back to the last migration out of Africa. And at some stage, people changed in colour and changed in the potential of melanin, the amount of melanin in their skin to fit the climatic conditions in which they were in. But the vast majority of the world first had people who were black within it. Regardless of where you go in the world, that was their colour. And so my argument is that is what it is. And indeed, that was the argument, and which is why I started talking about the southern states of the United States, for the southern states of the United States. If you had within you 1/32 of black blood in some states in the United States after the radical Reconstruction, so when it came into Jim Crow laws, when the whites in the South started to take back power, because under the radical Reconstruction, in the 1868, all the way up to 1877, blacks actually sat in the legislatures of the South. So they were black assistant governors, even a black governor. They were blacks running practically every aspect of Southern life because the majority of people in the South were black of some hue. So when the whites took back over, because they had the militaristic power, because what had happened is, in the radical Reconstruction, the Republicans had sent the Union Army into the South, effectively occupying it from 1867 onwards, to set out the way that the legislature should go. Because in the presidential Reconstruction, the President, Andrew Johnson, he had a very hands-off perspective as to how the South should come back. The radical, or the congressional Reconstruction, you can call it that, but there was a radical Republicans in Congress said that's not good enough. And they made it, the Union Army went in, the Union Army made sure that black people had their rights. And that meant because there were more votes, and because everybody was given the vote, blacks came into power. Now, why is that important? Because when the whites wanted to take back power of the South, the old guys who had slavery in their bones, the fellas who wanted slavery, who treated blacks so badly, and I'm going to go into how blacks were treated under slavery, because I think people don't understand how it worked, that these guys wanted to twist it back again to what it was. They knew they couldn't, because the 14th Amendment re-end, the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment re-enslave the blacks, but they could make it as near as damn it. So they brought out a lot of laws that suggested loitering, etc., and also brought in laws regarding whether your father had voted before you, whether you could read certain languages, etc., anything to stop blacks from voting and anything to take back power. Those are called Jim Crow laws, and we go back to that period in the southern United States. So what has this got to do with the United Kingdom? Because I'm just trying to tell you what black is. So under their system, 1/37 of black blood in you meant you were black. So you could be extremely light, straight hair, and the only thing about you is that you maybe looked a little bit suave, right? In most states, it was 1/16 or 1/8. And you're a little bit more than suave, but again, could you have straight hair, whatever. But again, you were perceived as black. That was it in the United States. You were black. And based as black, because that was where you had been under slavery, you now were treated abominably. Now let's go back to slavery very quickly, because I know people say, oh, they're bothered about slavery. And, you know, the Irish were slaves and 6 million Jewish people were killed in the Second World War. They don't moan about it all the time, etc., etc., etc. Right, so let's first get context. So the slave trade probably began in about 1492, funnily enough the same time when the Moors, who were blacks, under any criteria you wish to use as a general rule, were thrown out finally out of Spain, majority, not all by any means. And then what happened is that the Portuguese came up with the idea of moving people from the African continent across to the Americas, which they had newly founded, as they put it. You only need to go back to another black state, ancient Egypt, who had sent its ships to the Americas way back in pharaonic Egyptian times. So it wasn't the first movement across the Atlantic of peoples to the Americas. The ancient Egyptians had done that before. And as we know, Kon-Tiki seemed to prove that the Vikings had also done that. So what I'm saying is that in this latest movement, around about the 1490s, 1500s, deals were done with black leaders. The Portuguese did not control these areas, then with black leaders, that the blacks in African prisons of war were sold off to these guys because they were their prisoners of war. You know, they were people who were bad people in the perspective of these blacks. And they were sent to the Americas, not knowing what that would mean for these other black people later on. So they were sent there, taken across. And of course, because of the Morrish times anyway, I should explain that the Moors from 710 AD controlled much of the Iberian Peninsula, that's today's Spain and Portugal. And indeed, the Portuguese royal family was totally connected with people of colour, with black people. Right? The Portuguese royal family was known for that to be the case. Same way with some of the Spanish royal families, because there were many at one stage. And indeed, if you hear this thing about blue blood, well, this comes about because in Spain, during the Inquisition, which was to get rid of the Moors who were Islamic and black, because North Africa, as it is today, isn't North Africa as it was then, because there's been much more migration of lighter skinned people in North Africa than there was in that era. The people who you could see their blue veins through their skin, hence meaning that they were white, i.e. very light-skinned, you could see their blue veins, they were said to be true Christians. Not just Spaniards now, because there was the Spaniards as well, but Christians, not Morisco. Morisco was a mixture between the Moors and the Spanish. So if you could see your skin, your white blue veins, you had blue blood. And that was the idea of blue blood. That's where that comes from. Now, my argument is then, when we look at who decides who's black, we have this, as I said to you before, the United States at a legal definitional level saying 1/32, 1/16, or 1/8 means you are black. That's a legal definition. We also have Blumenbach's races, where Blumenbach, Swedish German, who made a decision that said these are one of the races, the 5 races of the world. Right. He includes in that North Africans for white people. Why? Because, of course, he's aware of ancient Egypt. And he doesn't want ancient Egypt to be part of the black world. So he brings them into the white world. But why? If you look at any of the statues of ancient Egyptians today, and just go to Egypt, and the first thing that will come to mind is, these look like black people. Because they are. And I'm just trying to think of a pharaoh who doesn't have that look. You might get it just in the last ebbings, if you will, of the last kingdoms of ancient Egypt after Cleopatra, and the Ptolemies coming through. You might get a lighter kind of Egyptian. But all the way backwards, this rubbish of the 25th dynasty is the only black dynasty, this is nonsense. This is the racist perspective of people who wrote ancient Egyptian history, who were white people, and wanted to take the people whom they know taught the ancient Greeks. And by the way, the ancient Greeks also were of colour, also were black and melanated. You cannot say that, example, a Scandinavian, pure white skin, pure white body, is white, yeah, and then say a Greek is white, and I'm not talking now via sunburn, or a Roman is white, or a a Spaniard or a Portuguese is white, if you look at these people's skin, they are clearly mixed race peoples, these people. And if you're going to say 1/32 means you're black, 1/16 means you're black, 1/8 means you're black, then all of these people are black. And indeed, in the US Census, if you looked at Mexicans, they were perceived as non-whites on 3 different occasions up until the latest change of the US Census. So what I'm saying is, if you took the US perspective, all these people are not white. So why would we just take the US? Why not take other countries? Well, if you took Britain, again, they would not be white, because Britain had a slave trade in the Caribbean in particular, and in the Caribbean, they wanted to keep the children of enslaved people blacks. Now, let's just hit on that, by the way, a little bit. I said I'd talk about the slave system. It wasn't all singing and dancing, as some people like to say. Basically, from about 8 years of age as a girl, you were open to be raped, buggered, to be fair, as a boy. Yeah, the slave owners buggered you, raped you. For the enslaved girls, 8, 9, 10, 11, whenever they could be childbearing, these people, these let's call them slave masters, slave owners, did what they wanted with these individuals. We don't talk about it because it's painful and people don't want to hear it. But it was de rigueur for slave owners to take whomever they wanted, female or male, depending on what their perspective was, and to rape them, bugger them, and do what they wanted. But there's also another aspect to that. It was an economic aspect. If you could have these, particularly, obviously the women, have them having children from 10, 12 onwards, then you've got a steady stream of enslaved people coming through. Now, sometimes the owners did that themselves because they liked doing it. They had their sons doing it. And sometimes they had black guys do it, whom they called as studs, and wanted to stud these women and just bring these women through so they got more enslaved people. And that was actually better, because the guys they brought in from Africa knew freedom, oftentimes tried to fight, found their way through, and oftentimes at a cost to the slave owner, because he had to punish them. And the punishments were many and different, from having a person defecate in the mouth of a slave who spoke back too often, with everybody looking, to one of the favourite ones in, say, Barbados, a British colony, was to basically put the person with molasses and put bees on them and have them basically stung to death. Chop an arm off, chop a leg off. But again, that was counterproductive, because you're chopping arms and legs off. These people can't work the way you want them to in the field. And this is money. So they kept them alive. So this is the difference. And I'm making you the difference, explain the difference between what the Germans did in the Second World War with Jews and Gypsies. Let's not forget the Gypsies, by the way, because their population was as decimated as the Jewish population was, particularly in terms of numbers, by the Germans, because they were seen as untermenschen just the way as Jews were. In fact, they were seen as greater untermenschen, because for the German, really, his fear with the Jewish people was that they were too capable, and that the people as they perceived them were getting jobs when they weren't properly Germans. Blacks in Germany, well, it's quite interesting. In some places, they did something to them, and in other places, they didn't. So there was a kind of a hands-off, hands-on, hands-off. If you want to throw you in a camp, yeah. Some blacks were even in the German army. So Germans kind of didn't have 100% feel as to what they wanted to do with blacks. But they did with Jews, whom they feared, and they did with Gypsies, who they loathed. So, and obviously there's other sectors of people, homosexuals, whom they loathed, or said they did, albeit much of the hierarchy was so orientated, but they said they had to loathe, again, this hypocrisy that comes through in most governments. And also, particularly fearful for them were communists. And that's why they had the Commissar Befehl with the Soviet army. So they probably killed about 15, 20 million Soviets, just for the fact that they were communists. Yes, fighting war, and the fact they were communists, no quarter was shown. So there wasn't the cold it's castle type perspective. These people were just killed if you tried to escape. So what I'm saying is, if you look at the Second World War, now that was, and you can look later on, if you will, in the killing fields, and you can look in Rwanda, killing fields in Cambodia or in Rwanda, and you can see the same. Loathing is one thing. That's not the system in slavery. There is a loathing, and they perceive the loathing and say it. But more importantly, with slavery, is the economic worth of utilising the individuals for economic wealth and well-being of the white populace. So you created black enslaved people, either by the slave owner or the overseer, oftentimes an Irish person. And for Irish, you need to understand, Irish people were not enslaved, they were indentured servants. And indentured servantry is nothing like slavery. Slavery, you have no rights. Right, let me explain this, because it's important. And then I'm going to move off that, the whole slavery issue, and I'm going to go into something else. 130, 140 years ago, definitely 200 years ago, as a black person in the Americas, throughout the whole of the Americas, as a general rule, an enslaved person, I'm talking an enslaved person now, in parts of the Middle East, but it was done differently, so I'll explain Middle Eastern slavery, because it was actually quite a lot different. Some parts of India, quite a lot different. Again, as an enslaved person, you had no rights over your own body. So that meant if you were being treated badly and you ran away, that was a crime. If you were being treated badly, as you were, worked to death, and you decided not to work and to withhold your labour, that was a crime. If you decided to give birth to your child and to nurture it, that was a crime, unless they wanted you to. If you wanted to keep your child, that was a crime, because they could just take the child as you wished. These were all criminal offences. And you know what the penalty was for all these offences? Death. In however way they wanted to do it. So not only was it the slave owner doing this, but the crimes were actually as statutes in many of these places. You were not allowed to read. An offence in many southern states. Punishable by death. Whatever the master wanted to do with you. Right? So there's a big difference to that and an indentured servant who has all the rights of a citizen, but is a servant to a particular master for the period of indentury. Yes, there were schemes to try and keep an indentured for as long as they could. You committed one crime, now you committed another. Yeah, extension of it. Yeah, great. But you were still a person, and there was still a legal limit as to what they could do to you. There was no legal limit. You were cattle. So the famous case is that when coming across the Atlantic, and the ship, as most slave ships were, was insured of its cargo, and that cargo was human beings, black human beings from Africa, when a ship's captain didn't have enough water to provide the black, or they were dying off some sort of disease because they were kept in absolutely stench and unbelievable conditions, and people were dying off because of smallpox or whatever it might be, any disease that could catch its way, dysentery, whatever, captains just threw you overboard. And basically once they throw you overboard, they can claim on the loss of the property which was insured by Lloyd's of London, or somewhere else, but generally Lloyd's, which is where it made its money from in the trade. Now, but what has that got to do with me, normal everyday Englishman? Well, by the time you get to the American Civil War and the colonies in Britain in the 1800s, early 1800s to late 1800s, all the way through indeed to the ending of slavery in Brazil in the 1880s, you had schemes whereby what would happen is that individuals would buy a stake in a slave. So, you may not be rich, but you may have, an eighth of a slave, which brought you some money in. And anybody else, to be fair, who had some money, many of them thought, yeah, what we're going to do, we're going to make money on this slave trade. And they put their money into the trade. So it was a real massive money maker on the European stock markets, etc., and around Europe and in the Americas. And what that did is it meant that stopping the trade was very, very difficult. So when they did stop the trade, what they did is they paid reparations. Let me say that again. They paid reparations, e.g. give money to all those people who had money in the slave trade, so who had a vested interest in it, who had money in it. They provided them all with whatever percentage they had and they paid out. And the British government has been paying that money out until recently. Because I hear some people turn around, oh, well, we did this to stop the trade. No, what you did is you paid money to white people, some wealthy, mainly wealthy, some not, who had money in the trade, not to the blacks. Blacks got nothing. The enslaved people got zero. You paid money to those who had money in the trade because, of course, many of the people who were tasked with preventing that trade, because it no longer looked good, and now one was going into colonialism. Slavery as itself wasn't necessary because you're controlling the countries now where they're from. So, and so you can no longer hide that it was abhorrent, albeit that, let's face it, between 1888 and about 1910, 1912, and then beyond, but the major damage was formed in that sort of period. King Leopold of Belgium went into the Congo, took the Congo over after the Treaty of Berlin in 1884, where the Europeans decided they would take over Africa and wouldn't fight each other to prevent that happening. Because if they'd have fought each other and allied with African states, that wouldn't have happened. So they had a big meeting, and that meeting was in Berlin, and they decided they wouldn't fight each other. They'd have places of interest that they'd go to, and they split the lines of Africa and then conquered it between themselves. So basically had all of Europe conquering it. In doing that, Belgium got itself the Congo, one of the biggest places. And when they originally took the country over, there's about 11 million people there, Africans. By the time they'd been in for about 20 years, there was only about, I believe it's about 4.5 million. The rest had exterminated. Chopped their arms off, chopped their legs off for not working, shot them in the fields, chopped them up. Whatever it was done to people who did not work the way the Belgian king wanted them to work, and by extension the Belgian people wanted them to work, albeit that the people had little to say to. This was performed on those individuals. So, as I said to you, that slavery, I'm going to leave that. I'll just say a little bit about slavery in the Far East, and maybe in Brazil, and maybe even in France and some places like that. There's the British way of slavery, the American way of slavery meant, frankly, that you were enslaved and you could never rise from it. And most slave owners wouldn't stand to these multiple of children that they created and made in those British and American colonies, or on Britain and in the British colonies and in the Americas. However, the French went about it a little bit different, and they had some of their children who were mixed race people, black and white, and they stood to those children oftentimes. So you get the anomaly even before the creation of the new France, because what we need to understand is the French Revolution changed everything. So you could call it the creation of the new French. You know, they moved from 7 days to 10 days, etc., etc., etc. Anything was on multiples of 10 months in the year. We don't hear about it anymore, but that's what it was. It was a massive change. So even before that change, and the king was in power, you had people who had made their money in Haiti or some other part of the French Empire, Guadeloupe, Martinique, or wherever it might be, had children with a black woman, and those children took the title of the father. So it wasn't an abnormal example for there to be chevaliers in 1780s, 1790s. Now, a chevalier is a knight who was black and living in Paris and living within Parisian society. You know, so you get the Alexandre Dumas père, the father of Alexandre Dumas, the writer. You get him being a chevalier. So being a sir and going to the finest schools, learning how to ride, learning how to fence, learning how to write music. You get the great celebrated Saint-Georges, who was said to be the finest swordman in France, one of the greatest museums of France, and that's a black guy. So in France, even under the royal patronage, the Three Musketeers is written actually by the son of General Dumas. He becomes a general in the change of the system then after the revolution. But he was already a ruling elite within, before the revolution. So France is anomalous in that way. You had the same happen with the Portuguese. This is because I believe that these people have been overrun by the Moors at one stage, and actually within their royal families, many of them were mixed race already in southern France, moving up northwards. Definitely in Portugal. There's a famous picture in 1480. It shows Lisbon, and a third of the people walking, I'm talking ruling class people walking in Lisbon with swords and fine clothing, are black. So what you've got to understand is the slavery we see in some countries isn't necessarily in others. Now, don't get me wrong, the French slavery was not a nice thing to be in. And Toussaint Louverture, who in Haiti took over, knew exactly how terrible it was. But people could make it to the top under that system, as they could, to some extent, under the Brazilian system, to some extent. Again, generally lighter-skinned people, because they could see they were of mixed race. Right? So generally lighter-skinned people. I'll say that again. So Brazil is a very racist society, of course, even today. But generally lighter-skinned people with some black heritage have made their way forward. Now, indeed, there's an old saying that says, if your grandmother isn't black, you're not a Brazilian. Now, that was changed a little bit about when you had a lot of the influx of Italians, heritage people after the First World and Second World Wars. But that was a very old saying and is acknowledged in Brazil because they're mixed race people in a generality. Same goes for Mexico in many ways. People forget that. And the absolutely same went for Argentina and many of the Central American countries. So we shouldn't perceive slavery in one place at all. Now, when you go across to the other side of the world, to the Middle East, you will see that in the Middle East, nearly all the people are mixed race there. So again, they call a black person somebody who's totally black. But going back in history, there's a fellow called Ibn Khalid. It was back in about 5th century. He wrote a treatise saying that blacks are superior to whites, etc., because that's who was ruling at the particular time. So this is how we need to understand race and how it runs. And then we can go back in our own time to the Roman times. And the picture of the person whom I have on this week's information as to what we're showing in the critical thinking is a picture of how Jesus Christ was said to look if you take it from the people of the time. Again, one can clearly see that he's not white. He has to be white in later periods of time when you're enslaving people of colour. But if you go back to the original, and that was the picture that I show on my information for this week's show, was one that was performed at the behest of the BBC by, I think, the university in Leeds, I think it was, who took samples of what people were like, utilising the latest techniques that one uses for facial reconstruction in murder cases, etc. So that is what Jesus Christ would look like. So again, completely different to the picture which we get now. In the West, if you look to the East, Christ as a black person was always so shown. Look into the Coptic church in Greece or in Russia, and you'll see how Christ is shown. Madonna and Child, you'll see how they're shown. So this idea that everything was white prior to slavery and post-slavery is nonsense. And we know that because we have the iconography. So this is what I said to you earlier on about ancient Egypt and its iconography. You have the statues there. They are there for all to see. It is not that they are made up. It's not that people's redone them later on. You can see the iconography and you can see whom they look like. Now, why do I say this? Because recently we've had a spate of people, actually it happened in the start of Obama really, when people said, oh, well, you say Obama's black, but he's not really. He's a white person, as much a white person as he's a black. Theoretically, that's true, because race is a biological nonsense. However, in the political reality of the world, he's absolutely black, Obama. You get the same argument with Lewis Hamilton. time and time again, people say, oh, what will Lewis Hamilton's mother think when he's denying her? No, it's that Lewis Hamilton walks down a street and somebody says to him, you're a black guy. Or when he was a kid, as he did with it, they'd say, you black bastard. They're not going to say, oh, you seemingly half-white bastard. No, they're not going to say that. So the actual political reality, and that's what I mean by that, I'm saying a geopolitical reality, is that he is a black person. And that's what I'm saying. Because everything suggests that. His features, the look, the world we live in and how the world we live in perceives people. Now, if you were in the Middle East, maybe you've got an argument where they say people are only black when they look extremely black, like, let's say, a Southern Sudanese. But now you might have an argument if that's what you're going to be saying. But you don't have an argument if you live in the West and your perspective has always been, forever and a day, when it is negative, and I stress that, when it's negative, that, oh, that's a black person. Oh, that robber, very light skinned, oh, he was black. Right? Because he's doing something negative. Positive, oh, well, he's half white. Right? This is the situation. So, the critical thinking aspect of the talk I'm providing is, why is race this powder keg? Why is it? Well, the reason why I brought the context of Jewish people and Cambodian people and even other black people in terms of the Tutsi and the Hutu and Gypsies is because if you say a race is other, you can then get away with a lot of things. There needs to be no biological aspect to it at all. By the way, of course, Jewish people are not a race. Jewish people are many different races. They are a religious body who follow a particular religious perspective. There are black Jews, there are white Jews, there are in-between Jews, there are, for want of a better word, Chinese heritage Jews, if we were going to talk about races. And again, that whole version of race is a quite difficult issue anyway, as I've said earlier on. Who is Blumenbach to decide what the races are in this world? Because actually, by the way, you may want to know this, when Blumenbach did his races, particularly Hungarian people may wish to know this, Hungarians were not perceived as white. If you look up the original Blumenbach's races, 1786 or something like that, look it up. I can't remember exact dates on this. Bear with me, but I want you guys to look and do the history. I'm doing this off the top of my head because I'm trying to keep it flowing. But if you look at Blumenbach's races, you will see Hungarians were not part of the white race. Now, today's politic has it that Orban, the Prime Minister thereof, of Hungary, does everything he can to say Hungarians are white and we should keep Hungarians white. But who decided, first of all, in Blumenbach's time, that they weren't whites, now decides that they are white? Who decides that? Where is somebody's perspective better than others? Where is my perspective on what I call white better than somebody else's perspective? Because I can be just as harsh on what is perceived as white, and I'll say the only people that are white are Scandinavian people and people that look and I can see their veins through the skin and I can see that they are blonde-haired and blue-eyed. Those are the only white people. Everybody else isn't white. And I can say everybody else is black or mixed race. Why would my definition be incorrect? This is the point you have to understand. So this is where we get into now everybody building this world we live in. Black, white, Chinese, whatever terminology you want to give to various peoples from around the world. Because you only need to look historically. And the start of many a thing that's happened is happened in ancient Egypt, happened in ancient China, before Europeans had started those issues. Then the Greeks who took forward, they are very, very clear. We learnt our knowledge from the burnt skins in Africa, in ancient Egypt. In fact, they even talk about the ancient Egypt coming from the land of Punt. and the land of Punt is in modern-day Somalia. Go across that small little sea that you have, the Red Sea, and go into the so-called Middle East. You will see that in days gone by, the vast majority of people moving across there were clearly black and mixed race, not white. The Aryan movement is later. Indeed, even Hitler says this, if you want to look at it. He turns around and says that the Aryans are not people in Greece. He talks about northern Greece, the Hellenic people in northern Greece solely. He says Crete has nothing to do with that. And if you know anything about Greek history, you'll know the Cretians had a great history, but they're nothing to do with that because he doesn't see them as Germanic. And he sees the only peoples that are white are the Germanic peoples. And some of them moved across into India. But little known about who moved across into India was also that you had black peoples, Africans moved across into India. And some of the Rajas, some of the bigger empires, were actually created by the blacks. Some blacks who were enslaved, in fact, initially. There are great Indians in the 16th, 17th century who were originally enslaved because their slavery was different, and so therefore you could move out of it at any stage and move in and become the favourite, because you're fighting in your wars or whatever, become the favourite of the king, and next minute they coup against the king and they take over and they rule the system. And that was done in many of the great Rajasthans, that particularly Somali, Ethiopian black took over and ran. And blacks coming down into the Swahili region, down into Kenya and places like that, took over and ran some of these areas in India and moved it all across into China. So we only have perspectives as black people, as histories, of the United States and slavery, and that's wrong. And so this is what I'm here to try and change. And even if we do look at the United States and slavery, what we don't talk about is we don't talk about the capacity of black people to create a situation, which is originally why I went to Herman Ousley, to show what was created, who were the great writers, like example, as I've mentioned earlier on, Alexander Dumas, who writes the Three Musketeers, the Count of Monte Cristo. By the way, he writes the Count of Monte Cristo about his father, who was a challenge to Napoleon, and indeed led Napoleon's armies in Egypt, when France did the ill-fated invasion of Egypt. That was led by his father, General Dumas. Again, the father of Russian literature. Alexander Pushkin, a black guy, the son of a black guy. General Dumas, who was a black guy who became the generals under Catherine the Great. So again, what I'm saying is that if we look at this wider history, we'll start seeing bigger things and more things. More people who've made the way through who were black, but we never hear of them because we do the concentration on slavery. And I have concentrated a lot on slavery just to give you a real understanding of it, and I shouldn't have done. I should have gone actually into the people who created other issues, but I wanted to put all the context there. In our own land of Great Britain, it's quite interesting. If you look back to the Roman era of Great Britain and you look at the population of England, I would say that the population of England in that era, the population of Roman Britain was about 2.8 million, something around that area. And of that, give or take, 130,000 would have been Romans. Well, Emperor Septimus Severus, a black Roman, from what is today Tunisia, but again, they did not look like people how they look today as a general rule, with his Legianus Africanus, with his African legions, probably about 50,000 in size. That is a massive element to that population. And these people had, went with local women, had children with those local women, were all parts of society. And indeed, if you go to York Museum, you will see today there's a woman there called Africa Bangled Woman, and she is of African heritage, but not from Africa, as it was at that time. She's probably, it says, from either Southern Europe or even England. So what I'm saying is that in that era, there were black people when there were only 3 million people in the country. So that should make us reconsider what we think our population was. And that's around about 210 AD, earlier on. And what is important at that era is that is before the Angles and the Saxons that we in Britain often see as our forebearers. So before them, the Angles and Saxons were these African Romans in large numbers in relation to the population, who had children with the local people and who lived amongst the local people, whose children probably were left behind in Britain at the time. So when people say this is not your land, I think we need to question that massively, that black people weren't in this land before some nonsense of 1948 when the Windrush turned up. This is the stupidity of the situation. If you don't know your history, that's what you say, oh yeah, well that is the case. But when you know your history, you say, hang on, so what were these Roman blacks doing here? And I'm not just talking any Roman, I'm talking the emperor and his armies. What were they doing in Britain? In large numbers for the population. And we have documented elements of blacks as well in later stages, much, much later stages, of course. But if you look at the 1601 proclamation by Queen Elizabeth I, she puts a proclamation out saying there are too many blackamoors here. Moors, of course, are black. In Britain, they say blackamoors, so you know they're black. See, when people turn around and say, oh, the Moors weren't black, it's nonsense, because we don't use the word Moor in Britain alone, or didn't use the word Moor alone. In Europe, they use the word Moor because Moor means black in most European languages. But in Britain, in English, it didn't mean that. So we put the word blackamoor to make it clear who the Moors were. And a blackamoor was practically any Moor. Now, when those people say, yeah, but that could have meant somebody else. No, because when they weren't black, they used the word tawny Moor. The same with tawny wine, which is a lighter skin, not by any means white. If you look at tawny wine, again, it's still dark, but it's a lighter dark. So this nonsense that Moors were white somehow, some sort of Arab white people, is a nonsense. And I've told you before that in the Arab world, most people were clearly of colour. So in Britain, in 1601, Queen Elizabeth I says there are too many blackamoors here and that they're taking our women, jobs and houses. 1601. So we have the Roman times. I've jumped 1,000 years to 1601. I could have gone on because obviously clearly blacks there throughout. I could have gone on, but I didn't. And I think this is what Black history should be about, explaining our presence in this country and in Europe, because you can go throughout the whole of Europe and see the same presence. Indeed, to be fair, in most of Europe, that presence is even larger. But okay, we've gone through it. So now at 1601, then you see the upheavals of things like the American Civil War. And yes, the population is much larger in Britain by that time. But what happens is that many of the blacks who fought on the side of the British, and as you know, we lost that conflict against the American, right? They were then shipped to Canada, which remained British. Now, they were meant to get shipped to Britain if they lost. That's what the proclamation was, to enslave people, fight with us, and if we lose the war, which we won't, we'll ship you back to Britain, right? It never happened in the first instance. So a brave woman, came together and went to the Royal Navy and to the representatives in Canada and said, we were promised that you would ship us to Britain. And she then went out and did a fantastic job in collating the numbers and finally got the Royal Navy to ship across to Britain X amount of individuals who were blacks because they'd been given poor land and weren't living very well. Now, a number stayed in Canada, quite a few actually, which is Canadian blacks. There's quite a few. But a substantial number were shipped to Britain. And the figures vary from, I've seen 3,000 to 15,000. The figures vary. One which I discount was probably about 30,000. I discount that number. I don't know why I discount it, but I do. If I've discounted too low, I'd say maybe 15,000 was shipped to Britain. And with the blacks that were already in Britain and these others that turned up, that was a substantial number of black people, particularly in the port areas. And the others have come from all over the place, from Africa, from the colonies, which at those times were the West Indian colonies. So to try and get rid of these people, Sierra Leone is bought by the British, and it's suggested that they should leave Britain with their wives, who are generally white, and go and live in Sierra Leone. Now, some do, but the vast majority do not go and live in Sierra Leone. And so most people stay sitting in Britain. And there's a thing called the Poor Black Relief. And the reason why you know that is it's in Hansards, which is, if you know Parliament, everything that's ever said in Parliament is written down. And in Hansards, it shows one MP standing up saying, you can't go in a town, a village or a hamlet where you don't see these people, black people he's meaning. And he says something like the offspring of their loin for the lower order of woman seems to like them. Right? So he's basically saying there's blacks everywhere, get rid of them, which is why they try and get Sierra Leone. Well, of course, you don't get rid of them that easy, and they don't leave. And of course, because you now have the colonial environment and the colonial perspective, and as time moves on, a greater colonial perspective, any person from the colonies has a right to move around the colonies because they're all British. Now, the vast majority can't, they assume, because they're not wealthy enough. But some do. And so throughout, from that 1750s, 1770s, 1800s, you will see blacks trickling into Britain. And then when the wars happen in Britain and they require people to fight the wars, you'll see it indeed in the Battle of Trafalgar. You'll see the two guys holding up, where I guess is one of Britain's greatest heroes, who dies at the Battle of Trafalgar. The two guys holding him up are two black guys. And then there's a Turkish-ish looking fellow, maybe Omani, dark-skinned guy, who's there as well on the original paintings. If you look at the paintings subsequently, those are changed, and you get basically the ship's ensigns and the ruling elite British people holding him up. But if you go into the Foreign Office and you go into the Great Room, you'll actually see, on the walk up to it, you'll actually see the original pictures. And it's black geezers who are holding him up. Admiral Lord Nelson when he's dying. Yeah? Who are fighting Britain's wars. We could go on, and I could go on forever talking about the discoveries that black people have made in the past, be it from America, be it from Brazil, be it from Arabia, be it from the medicines that came out of Egypt. I could go on forever, but that's another area that in the black history we should be looking at. We should be explaining that. We should be explaining that Edison, yes, created the light bulb, but his light bulb burnt out within 30 seconds because the filament was rubbish. And the guy who created the filament was a guy by the name of Thomas Latimer. And that guy, Latimer, has his name on every filament today because he was able to say to Edison, listen, you can have my filament, but this time I want some recognition for what I've done. And because Edison, who had lied about the fact that his light worked, and was into Hawk and knew he was going to get in trouble, he agreed to it. So for once, this black guy who worked for Edison and worked for him for a day actually got his name on some of the inventions, on that particular invention, which is the electric light filament. And you'll still see it on today. But of course, he was ripped off otherwise. Because that's what happens when you don't have a position of power, particularly if you're in the United States, and the laws don't defend you in that era. The traffic lights were created by a black guy. Shoes and the speeding of the shoe sole were created by a black guy. I mean, I could go on and on and on, but I won't, because it's pointless in this short period. It isn't pointless if that's what we concentrate on in Black History Month. And that's the point I'm making. Critically thinking, that is what we should be concentrating on. Explaining to people, this is what blacks have done to young blacks. This is what you've written historically. This is what you have created historically. This is what you have done historically. So their heroes are people other than just sportsmen of the 20th century and sportswomen or singers of the 20th. Even in that domain, let's face it, even in that domain, people aren't given their due. So the king of rock and roll is Elvis Presley. Well, we all know the king of rock and roll is not Elvis Presley. And indeed, the colonel who runs Elvis Presley, his manager, the great colonel, he turned around and said, I looked around the South to find a white guy who did what the blacks were doing and understand the blacks because they live with them. That's what he said. To move like the blacks moved, because they wanted somebody like Little Richard, who is, potentially one of the creators. Don't get me wrong, Elvis Presley's a great singer, great mover, great dancer, good-looking guy, but he's not the creator. This is the point I'm making. But in a land that cannot give you the creation of what you do, then that's the problem. The man they called the king of jazz was a Italian-American, light-skinned, Italian-American guy. And they called him the king of jazz because he didn't want to give jazz to people like the great Satchmo and others. So the king of jazz had to be somebody who you could say was white. Now, this is not me making this up. This is me telling you what was going on. So when people say you've got a chip on your shoulder as a black person, no, what they have on their shoulder is a knowledge, a belief that when you create, your creations are not given to you. Let's look at dancing. It's very popular, Strictly Come Dancing. The so-called Latin dances that they do, from the tango to the samba to the salsa, they're all black dances. As I told you before in Argentinian tango, that blacks were a half of the population. They were down in the docks, and that's where that dance started, down in the docks with black Argentinians. The Argentine tango. Salsa is Cuban, black Cubans. Marinda, black Cubans. When you look at the Charleston, blacks doing the Charleston, white upper classes copied it. It was a black dance. In fact, they said it was vulgar because blacks did it. Rock and roll of any type was said to be vulgar, created by blacks. Only when whites took it over was it becoming different, right? So what I'm saying is, this has been the situation forever and a day. So even in the areas that I'm not that bothered about, to be fair, because we do have some element of recognition, even that element of recognition isn't a true element of recognition. It's hidden. The authors are hidden. Nobody tells you, as I said, that Alexander Dumas is black. I was speaking to some French people some time ago, great guys and gals, fantastic. We were in a major police course. We were teaching individuals, and they were all senior individuals in France. In fact, one of them was chief of police in Paris. Good guy, great guy. We're talking, I said, oh yeah, Alexander Dumas, a black guy. What? Laughing. France never told them that. The greatest writer of general stories, and he's never been explained. And when they then had somebody play him in a movie that they did quite recently, because they've now begun to change things, they took a white actor, and this is, 5 years ago, and put darkness on his skin to portray him as, a little bit swarthy. So that's what the French did. And this is a country that actually, for many a year, for 200 years, the blacks in France had a much higher degree of success than they did in the United Kingdom or the United States. The guy in the First World War who ran the air defence of Paris, the general in charge, was a black guy. That could only have been dreamt of in Britain. Indeed, it took Walter Tull, great ex-footballer and then British Army officer, it took him an inordinate amount of time to become an officer, because the British rules said no black person can be an officer over white people, and indeed shouldn't be an officer at all. You look at the RAF, and I'll tell you about the RAF because when the Windrush comes into the harbour, Tilbury docks I believe it is, and the BBC come on board to see all these guys from the Caribbean and to talk to them, the reporter actually is very clear and says, you're all ex-servicemen, aren't you? Or the vast majority. And they say, yeah, we're in the RAF, we're in the Navy or whatever else, like my father was in the Merchant Navy throughout the Second World War. So this is the thing. This is what the Black History Month, to my mind, should be explaining. And when I went to Herman Ousley all those years ago, this is what I said to him. You need to explain our contribution to this land, our contribution in Europe, our contribution in Africa, our contribution in Asia, our contribution in the United States, our contribution in the Americas. Half of the people in these battles in the Americas for their freedom against Spain were blacks. Indeed, Christopher Columbus, on his ship, when he comes in to the Americas for the first time, many of them were blacks and mixed race people, if I want to make a differentiation, but I could just say blacks. Many of them on board those ships. Many, not one, two, many, because that was the population of Spain at the time. Although Christophe Colon is, as you know, an Italian, but he's working on behalf of the Spanish Queen. So what I'm saying is the history, when it's not told properly, throws up a whole lot of ambiguities. When Meghan came into the royal family, we said, oh, first time somebody's in the royal family who happens to be black. Nonsense. Total and utter nonsense. This honour went out way before with a Portuguese royal family member who married the king of England. King George's wife, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, had the Portuguese connection and was hence mixed race, black. So I mention all of this because we need to understand our full history. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave it again because we've come to the time when we're expanding beyond what we should do. But I just want to basically say the whole point of this, the whole point of the critical thinking element thereof, is that we should think outside the box. And we, if speaking about Black history, should speak about it in its full regalia, all the way back to Roman times, all the way back to Egyptian times, and all the way forward. And I would want people to contact me. I would want them to say I'm talking rubbish. Please send me your points. Tell me I'm talking rubbish. Send it to me. Hammer me with this. Please do. I'm keen to be hammered. Because if I'm wrong, I need to know. I guess because I know I'm right. Thanks again, ladies and gentlemen. And we'll see you again with a different show next week.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
More than a quarter of a century, I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.